Hey guys, Rafe here from the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. So this week, I'm extremely excited to welcome on John Vervaeke. John Vervaeke is a cognitive psychologist and a cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto. In addition, he's a practitioner of Tai Chi Chuan, which is a movement practice, Vipassana, which is a meditation practice, and Metta, which is a contemplation practice. And he is really interested in trying to solve the problem of what he calls the meaning crisis. He has a series of lectures coming out right now called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So I was really excited to get him on because this is a huge topic that informs the Evolve, Move, Play approach. We're really aimed at helping people overcome the movement crisis through movement practice. So there's a lot of common language that Vervaeke and I shared, and it became a very interesting conversation that moved rapidly across topics. I think you guys are going to get a lot out of it, but it might be a little bit hard to follow at times. So if you're having trouble following, please send me a question about anything that you missed, or check out John Vervaeke's lectures. He also has a book on zombies and the meaning crisis, and we'll put that in the show notes as well. So without further ado, I think you guys are going to really enjoy this. John Vervaeke. Welcome to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast, where we bring you the most interesting and enlightening conversations around movement practice and how you can become the most heroic version of yourself through pursuing movement that's relevant to your nature. This is a podcast that's going to feature some of the top movers in the world, some of the most amazing movement thinkers, and people from fields that are related to movement as far afield as evolutionary theory, strength and conditioning, and everything in between. So if you're interested in movement, please stick around. And if you like our work and want to support it, please consider supporting us on Patreon, because this podcast is completely listener supported. We don't want to take any advertising. We don't want to interrupt your experience of watching the show. So what really helps us get the best thinkers on, have the time to put these together, have the best quality for you guys as far as audio and video, is your support. So please consider supporting us and enjoy the rest of the show. John, welcome to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. I'm super excited to have you on. You're a cognitive psychologist, is that correct?
I'm both a cognitive psychologist and a cognitive scientist. So I'm at the University of Toronto. I'm in the psychology department, and I'm also in the cognitive science program. So I'm both a cognitive psychologist and a cognitive scientist.
Okay, awesome. And you also are a teacher of Vipassana, Tai Chi Chuan, and Metta, is that correct?
That is correct, yes. I teach those extracurricular at a place called the Multi-Faith Center, also at the University of Toronto. Yeah.
Very cool, very cool. So I think you just popped up in my YouTube feed as like something I'd be interested in. And I saw that you had this series of lectures called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So I've been considering all those, reading through some of your, listening to some of your other interviews, listening to your discussion with Jordan Peterson, all really interesting stuff. And I love the way that you're kind of bringing together the cognitive science with the philosophy, and then the spiritual traditions and the traditions of wisdom.
Yes.
And so I think the place to start, obviously, is with the question of meaning and
right,
and what the meaning crisis is. So I think it'd be interesting to frame this a little bit through this movie Fight Club, because I was listening to
yeah.
You're talking about the having mode versus the being mode.
That's right. That's right.
And I happened to listen to another friend of mine in an interview, and he was talking about Fight Club, and it reminded me of that. So those two things kind of popped in my head together. And so I don't know how well you remember the movie, but basically it starts with this guy going through this totally meaningless gray existence.
Yes, yes.
And he meets this character, this charismatic character, Tyler Durden. So the narrator and Tyler Durden then go and they sit in a bar together. And Tyler says, we work at jobs that we hate to buy things that we don't need to impress people we don't like.
Yes, yes. It's a very telling, yeah.
And I think that is as, that's as kind of evocative a description of what it feels like to be stuck in this meaning crisis as you.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. I think that's a very apt thing. I think that's a very good description of sort of the experience of meaninglessness. And I think we should talk about it in terms of its symptomology, the kinds of symptoms that we're seeing. I think it's reasonable to think that the meaning crisis is one of the ways is it's expressing itself is in like the mental health crisis, the rise of anxiety, depressive disorders, the fact that although worldwide suicide is declining, we're getting an upsurge in suicide in young people or places in the United States, that you're getting the addiction crisis, the opioid crisis is rising. You get the sense, and Chris Mastropietro and Philip Misovic and I talked about this in the book on the zombies, you get the increasing sense of the pervasiveness of bullshit in our society, and I use that term in a technical sense, so like Frankfurt's notion. You get you get this weird paradox that everything is being politicized, but the political process is being disavowed by most people. People are disenfranchising. They are pulling back, right? Voting is going down generally. There's spikes, of course, over particular things, but in general, it's going down. You have disenfranchisement from religious institutions. You have the increase in in loneliness. It's telling that the United Kingdom has created a new ministry of loneliness, which is like, it sounds Orwellian. And so you have all of this going on, and then I think, as I argued with Chris and Philip, you have the mythological expression of it. You have the zombie zeitgeist. You have this pervasive, mythology of the zombie and the zombie apocalypse for a culture. And if we want to talk about it later, I think the zombie is a way in which our culture is trying to mythologically articulate and express this sense of meaninglessness. So I think all of these things are ways of trying to get at what the meaning crisis is.
So years ago, like as I've been building up what I do, I actually started as an anthropology student at university and had this background doing martial arts since I was a child.
Great.
Started teaching gymnastics and then parkour. And so I articulated that there's this fundamental paradox that we're facing in modern society, which is that in a lot of ways, as like documented by Steven Pinker, we live in the best world that you could ever live in, right? Like, safest, you have the most abundance of food, the best music, everything's available at your fingertips. And yet people are suffering, right? This is, I put out this talk in like 2012, and a lot of these things have accelerated a lot since then.
Yep, very much.
But like at that time, I think it was like 1 in 5 American women are on some kind of, or maybe it was 1 in 10 American women are on some kind of psychiatric medication.
Yeah.
The rate at which little boys are being given Ritalin is like 1 in 5. It's extraordinarily high.
And so, yeah, I think, yes. And I think that's a wonderful contrast that's come up in some of my courses, the contrast between Pinker, who's still sort of advocating an enlightenment ideology. I mean, enlightenment in the historical sense, not like Buddhist enlightenment, right? And that, all we have to do is do and then, no, what we seem to be happening is, no, people are getting in many ways, right? More and more fundamental. This is not an adequate word. They're getting unhappy. The problem with happiness is it conflates many different things together. And so I think the part that we're talking about of what's lumped into happiness is, again, this meaningfulness, the meaning in life part. It's telling, for example, that as the American economy over the last few years has sort of improved, that the happiness rating of the United States is still declining, going down significantly.
So, okay, cool. I'm really excited now. And now kind of, I'm not sure where to go, but this is a central concept to me, right?
Yeah.
For my work is all based on this evolutionary idea, right? We have an evolved nature.
Yes.
Movement practices should be congruent with our evolved nature. And then in general, we need to kind of think about cultivating ourselves in reference to the idea that there is some basic thing underneath that responds well to certain things and not to other things.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so ways I have about talking about that. So there's lots of I'm trying to develop, a conceptual vocabulary, a theoretical grammar for trying to articulate this in ways that go both ways, in ways that work both ways, that help give people a way of making sense of their lived experience, but also can connect to the scientific enterprise of studying these things and understanding them empirically. And so one of the things I've been trying to do, again, in conjunction with other people, like a lot of really good work I'm doing with Dan Chiappi on this, is like to pay attention to other the many ways in which we know, or at least the many ways in which we learn. So we're very focused on propositional learning in our culture. We have a very belief-centric culture. We think that what knowledge is right, to have a proposition that we assert. That's a belief, right? So, and I'm a scientist. Propositional knowledge is really important. Theories are propositional knowledge, right? And
Yeah.
I'm not dissing that at all, right? But knowing, that kind of knowing is not the same as three other kinds of knowings that I want to talk about. And I think your practices bring them together in very important ways. And I want to talk to you about that.
Yeah.
But let me just articulate them first. One is procedural knowing. This is knowing how to do things, like how to catch a ball or how to ride a bicycle, and this works in terms of, your skill. Then there's your perspectival knowing. This is the ability to generate perspectives. So I'm generating a perspective right now. You are salient to me. You are foregrounded. Things are backgrounded. So things are salient and obvious to me. There's a field of salience and obviousness that is dynamically, constantly being sculptured by me as I move and reflect on my environment, right? And that is really, really central. And so you don't realize how important this is unless you look at some things. Like the work I'm doing with Dan is with scientists who work with the rovers on Mars. And what they're trying to do is, what do you do to have a sense of presence? So instead of just sort of reading information about Mars, what do you do so that you actually feel as if you're on Mars, right? And because you really need that to interact well, right? So that sense of presence. And you're trying to create it in virtual reality and all kinds of things. So there's that perspectival knowing. And then there's an even deeper kind of knowing. There's the kind of knowing that's participatory knowing. It's the kind of knowing that is about the deep ways in which you and reality are conformed and connected together. Let me give you just a way of understanding this. This is something we learn, but we think it is natural to us, right? We see the world as a story, and we come to understand ourselves as a story, as an autobiography, right? And that's right. And so we are a story, right, within a story, and the world is an evolving story, and so we know. Do we know this? It's not really it's not something we know. It's a foundation of how we can, be who we need to be, and the world be what it needs to be, so that all the other knowings are possible for us. Did that make sense?
Yeah. I'm super. This is one of my favorite points that you make. It's something that's really interesting to me from coming from a movement background, right? Because
totally.
Because I can describe for you how to do a movement skill.
Yes.
And you don't have an embodied sense of it, right?
That's right.
And I've recognized this repeatedly through, because I'm very attracted to scientific literature. I love to read and absorb tons of information, but I recognize more and more that that information that's only in that propositional area is relatively limited, and that a lot of the most important wisdom that we can generate happens at these other things. So if you would, for me, can you just repeat the four types of knowing that you've laid out?
Yeah. So there's the propositional. And there's procedural. This is knowing how. Perspectival. This is like you're doing it right now. Things are salient and obvious to you in this really textured, dynamic, landscape, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's participatory. This is the way in which you are assuming identities and assigning identities to the world such that you and the world fit together. You're tuned to each other so that you can acquire beliefs, you can acquire skills, you can generate perspectives that aren't weird or horrific to you, right? And I think the point you made just before you asked my question is the crucial thing. I think that most of the core meaning making that goes into a meaningful life, as opposed to a meaningful statement, is the way in which that procedural, perspectival, and participatory knowledge is connecting us to the world, right? And connecting us to ourselves and connecting us to each other. And so, and I think also wisdom has to do with most of those, right? Wisdom is not about what you know, it's more about the how of knowing.
Knowing information is one thing, but knowing the relevance of the information is another thing.
That's exactly what my work is all about. I mean, so my primary cognitive scientific work is on a theory of relevance realization, right? Which is a theory about, because this is the primary problems brains face. Out of all the information available to you, what information do you find relevant? What information are you going to pay attention to? Out of all the information in your head, what information are you going to find relevant such that you're going to remember it, right? Out of all the different patterns of behavior you can engage in, which set of actions are you going to select as relevant? And then how are all of those relevant to each other? This is the core thing that makes you a cognitive agent. And I think I would argue that, I have explicitly argued, and with other people, like with Tim Lillicrap and Blake Richards and Leo Ferraro and others, that process of relevance realization is happening way below the level of, sort of our beliefs and stuff like that.
Yeah, so there's this central problem that I think, is revealed in some sense through physical practice.
Yes.
That the majority of us is happening at a subcognitive level.
Yes. Well, I would at least say a sub-inferential, sub-semantic, sub-representational level. But see, I'm not trying to be finicky. But see, part of what I'm trying to do as a cognitive scientist is to get people to understand how cognitively important those levels are. So I want to extend the notion of cognition to those.
Yeah. So it's somewhat blind to the narrative self, you could say.
Totally. Although narrative taps into it in powerful ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really there's so many ways we could go here. It's very interesting to me because this problem that you just referenced, I think, is the central problem that we face in life. It's the central problem in movement practice. It's something that I feel like is revealed through all these different resources that I'm looking at, which is that there's way too much out there. It's far too complex, and we have to somehow choose to pay attention to things in order to actually act. And in choosing to pay attention to things, we're inherently setting a value structure to them. So
that's very much.
Yeah. So, I mean, as I said in the email, I've been very influenced by Jordan Peterson, your colleague. But also I've seen the same kind of realization in John Boyd, the military strategist, in Nikolai Bernstein and J.J. Gibson, who are hugely influential in the whole arena of like motor theory right now.
Of course. I mean, I was privileged to study J.J. Gibson with John Kennedy, one of his greatest, proteges.
Yeah.
John Kennedy had a huge influence on me. And so my whole orientation towards third generation cog sci and the whole ecological, embedded, embodied approach was deeply influenced by that confrontation with Gibson.
That's awesome. Yeah. So I'm actually like, I think this may be interesting. I'll just give you a tiny bit of background. I don't want to go too deep into it because the audience might know this, but essentially I came from, gymnastics, right? And I had a very linear pedagogy of teaching, very much sort of technical, biomechanical based teaching. I then started teaching parkour, and I brought that into that and built all these sort of atomized ways of teaching people movement. And then I took my parkour and I took it into nature. And as I was teaching people in nature, something really interesting happened, which is that I had basically a set of drills that I would take people through, and a set of errors that I expected to make, and then a set of cues that I would give based on those errors.
Right.
What happened is they stopped making a lot of the errors as soon as I put them in trees instead of boxes in the gym.
Right.
And they started self-organizing and generating skills that I hadn't yet taught them.
Right.
So I was like, whoa, this is, at first I was actually kind of like, it hurt my ego. Because
what am I for?
But what I did was I kind of leaned into it, and I started thinking about this idea of like, how do I trick my athletes into learning things?
Yeah.
And I had one of my students who actually pointed out that I was essentially operating within like a dynamic systems approach.
Totally.
And so I've kind of been doing that, let's say, on a very intuitive level for 6 years. And then just within the last couple of years, I've gone and started reading like Franz Bosch, who's kind of the biggest guy bringing that into the strength and conditioning community, reading Nikolai Bernstein. You've read Bernstein as well, right?
I don't think so. I mean, so I'm more familiar with like Alicia Uraro's book, Dynamics in Action, in which she really tries to integrate dynamical systems theory into explaining behavior, human behavior.
So
go ahead. Go ahead.
I think it'd be really so. In any event, I'm reading Bernstein, I'm reading Bosch, and following as well Peterson, who's also talking about J.J. Gibson, and then
Yeah.
the guys within the movement teaching community who are trying to teach elite team sports athletes how to have better movement skills, how to recognize affordances in the environment, as you frequently talk about. They're all basically talking about this confluence between Gibson and Bernstein.
Yeah.
So all this is fairly new to me, right? I'm playing with it. It has a lot of intuitive meaning for me, but I don't have the same layer of kind of depth in understanding where these theorists come from. So that's just kind of like how this perspective arrived for me. And within that, there's this central idea that essentially what we're trying to do in creating an adaptive athlete is solve this problem of the complexity of the environment, and how do you make the athlete adaptive to orienting towards what's relevant in their environment, what their action capabilities are to the environment, and then how to make the right decisions and act upon that. And
that just dovetails with like the core of my work. First of all, the framework, I mean, because, third generation cog size, it precisely about this marriage, right, of, dynamical systems with, ecological understandings of perception and action, right? And those are the two, foundations, the two columns on which you build third generation cog sci. And then the central problem that has been the core of all of my scientific work, everything, all of this stuff I do on meaning and wisdom and insight and flow and altered states of consciousness and, blah, 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 blah. It all is grounded in how does the brain do relevance realization?
Sure.
How does the embodied brain do relevance realization? And the key part of my argument is it's exactly because of its embodiment that the brain is capable of doing relevance realization. And so all of that fits together. So, I mean, what you said is very consonant, both with the framework that I'm using in my work and even in the video series, and then the central problem that I've tried to tackle scientifically. And then what my main my main project is, can I take this understanding of the relevance realization machinery and then use it to get back like non-trivial, non-hackneyed understandings of meaning and life and wisdom, so that they become powerful, challenging, and also affording terms for people, as opposed to what they have generally decayed into for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is so, to quote Peterson, who basically says, we have that scientific model, which is propositional, and that tells us what the world is like. And then we have this model of how to act in the world. Yeah. And it's my kind of way of thinking about this. And I think that this dovetails with what you're saying, is that as we've scaled up our ability to solve problems in that propositional zone, in that what is zone, we've somehow undercut our ability to think effectively about and solve problems in the how to act in the world problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a succinct way of putting it. I mean, the series goes through, there's a very long, complicated historical process with many factors, but I think that is one of the key results of it, that we basically, right, we've got this sort of lopsided development, and we've also sort of culturally identified with it. We've even reduced, and I think that's the right word, we've reduced spiritual traditions to belief systems. We talk about spirituality as beliefs, right? As if the belief structure is the core of even these systems. And so I think, we have lost touch with, again, how to activate, access, articulate, express, and enhance a lot of this machinery that's making meaning, that's allowing us to fit ourselves to a complex, dynamically changing world in a dynamically adaptive manner. And also to, I think this is something we need to talk about. That adaptive machinery, right, that's telling us what's relevant, is also the same machinery that tends to become like overwhelming to us when we're engaged, when we're falling prey to self-deception.
Yeah.
And so the very machinery that makes us adaptive by making things salient and obvious to us is also the machinery that makes us self-deceptive by making the wrong things salient and obvious to us. And so we also need to think about, again, wisdom as, what we need. It's not only that we need to get in touch with this machinery, we need to get in touch with this machinery in ways that afford our capacity for self-transcendence, for going through the developmental changes that will make us capable of seeing through these illusions and reconnecting to reality in a better way. So what I'm saying is, it's not just that we are ignorant of the machinery, we are also ignorant of the way in which that machinery can cause us to fall prey to illusion and self-deception.
Yeah, absolutely. So much interesting stuff to pick up there. I think maybe it'd be interesting for me to just kind of go through what I saw as your core points, I've read, and then we can build off of that. So we have this machinery, as you said, that allows us to engage in all this complex ability to realize relevance, right? Humans have more cognitive sophistication than anything else, but that also seems to have this downside that we have this ability to bullshit ourselves.
Totally, very much, yes.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so then in your lecture series, it seems like the kind of overarching point that you're trying to make is, one, this is the machinery that we have. It can be optimized.
Yes.
After the Bronze Age, at the beginning of the Axial Revolution, there was this whole set of psychotechnologies
that's right
developed that allowed us to essentially go along the path of cultivating wisdom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think so.
These psychotechnologies were built into a worldview that had an idea of a supernatural, another plane of existence that was more real. Right?
Yes. Yeah. The two worlds mythology. Yes.
Yeah. There's two worlds. And then when the scientific revolution started to undercut that, lost the ability to effectively sort of transmit those technologies.
Yes.
Or to talk about them effectively. And so it seems like your project is it seems like there's this emergent confluence between what we're learning from cognitive science and what we're learning from psychology and in these other fields that's actually revealing some of those truths of those traditions and giving us a better language to talk about them.
That's exactly right. Wow, I'm really impressed. You did that extremely well. So congratulations. So yeah, I think that's important because it wasn't just a scientific revolution; it's a whole bunch of things. It's the Protestant Reformation, but that's definitely a watershed point. Yeah. And so, and what the scientific revolution gave us for a very long time is a worldview in which we don't fit, right? So we have a scientific explanation of everything, but we don't have a scientific explanation of how we generate scientific explanations, or how we generate the meanings that make scientific explanations possible, or how we create the communities that do the science that make the scientific worldview. We don't have good, right? So we don't fit into that worldview. And so I think that's important. So it's like when I say mythology, I'm saying something really important here. I'm not saying like a fable or a fiction, right? A mythology is a way of using imagery and metaphor to create a structure where we get that worldview attunement that you and I have been talking about, right? We get that, here's me and here's the world and here's how I fit into the world, right? And so we don't have a world, and that two-world mythology, legitimated and help people articulate and express how the psychotechnologies could afford self-transcendence, right? How it could take you out of the world of decay or illusion and into contact with realness. And we can maybe talk about it later. People have these profound experiences of being in contact with, the really real or intense realness. And those are deeply transformative of them. Yeah. But what happened is we no longer have a worldview, as we've just said, that legitimates and articulates self-transcendence, because we don't even belong to that worldview, let alone giving us an account of how we find meaning and self-transcendence in it. Now, what's happening in third generation cog sci, and I think in other disciplines, but I can only speak of my own, right, is that we're getting a scientific worldview that is starting to answer all these questions about meaning making and all these other kinds of knowing, that would both give us an understanding of them and how to optimize them, and also re-legitimate them. Tell us, yes, this is how we fit in to the scientific worldview. And so now I understand, right, how I and the world work together and why this makes sense and why this is a real thing to talk about, right? And so it's very important that people have this worldview attunement that situates, organizes, and legitimates the psychotechnologies of self-transcendence.
Excellent. So what comes up for me there is that when let's say our worldview, our let's say that we had the scientific, rational, materialist worldview, and that worldview becomes dominant, and now we have these traditions of wisdom that in some level were seemed incongruent, or the language that they were built in is incongruent.
I think they still are in some ways. So go ahead. Yep.
And what strikes me is that once those worldviews have to sort of articulate themselves in ways that seem incongruent with our basic understanding of the world, they're prone to bullshit.
Yes, very much, very much.
So I want you to go ahead. I don't think you've given the technical definition of bullshit, which I think
sure.
You talk about bullshit and yeah, expand on that idea of how we're going to recover the positive without getting stuck in the bullshit layer, and how
right.
Congruence.
That is so much the finesse of what is going on here. Totally. Yeah. Okay, so the term, I'm using bullshit in a way that is inspired by and derived from Harry Frankfurt's seminal essay on bullshit that he now wrote 20 years ago. And Frankfurt was interested in making an important distinction between the liar and the bullshit artist, or the bullshitter, whatever you want to use. You see, the liar manipulates you because of your commitment to the truth, because truth matters to you, right? At least some truths, right? I can alter your behavior by getting you to believe that something is true, because then you will adjust to that truth, right? And so that's how lying works. Now, according to Frankfurt, the bullshit artist works in a totally different way. The bullshit artist basically gets you to be indifferent to the truth, to not care about whether or not something is the truth. I sort of add on that a little bit and say, well, what the bullshit artist is doing is getting you, right, not motivated by what's true, by getting you motivated by what you find salient, what's catchy to you.
Yeah.
So the prototypical example of this is advertising. This is one example I often use, right? You see a commercial, there are people in a bar, somebody drinks, and then attractive people appear, right? You know that's not true. You just have to go into a bar. That's just not true, okay? And they know that you know it's not true. That doesn't matter. And they pump hundreds of millions of dollars into this commercial because it's not about truth. It's about making the alcohol salient to you and catchy to you as an idea. And you know what you do? You go out and buy that brand of alcohol, because not because you believe, but because it's been made salient to you. It catches your attention. It arouses your affect in powerful ways, right? And so you can see, and my favorite example of this from sort of political satire was an old episode of The Simpsons. I gave this talk once and somebody went and found it, right? You know, there's the aliens and they're giving a speech, and it's like, my fellow Americans, when I was young, I dreamt of being a baseball, but now we must move forward, not backwards, upwards, not forwards, twirling towards freedom. And it's gibberish. It means nothing, but you laugh because you know, right? You know, that causes often a rush in Americans. You know, there's baseball and there's freedom and there's going upwards,
yeah.
Twirling, which is like this, right? And it's, you know, and so you can make things very salient as a bullshit artist and manipulate people by getting them to do two things. Don't care about the truth. Like, don't make that, try not to let the truth matter to you, sort of put the truth aside and then get caught up in how catchy it is. Let me just make one more point and then I'll let you respond. For me, this is central because I think it gives us a fundamental insight into how self-deception works, because we use the metaphor of lying to ourselves as a way of trying to explain self-deception. And I think that's a very misleading metaphor, because technically you can't lie to yourself. You can't believe, that Susan loves you, or Susan doesn't love you, let's say. I can't believe that, and then sort of say to myself, Susan loves me, and just because belief doesn't work that way. You can't just make yourself believe, and you can't just hold opposite beliefs. So you can't really lie to yourself, but you know what you can do? You can bullshit yourself. Because what you can do is you can alter how things are salient, right, by the way they interact with your attention. So suddenly this glass is salient to you.
Yeah.
Because of the way I brought it into your attentional field. So salience grabs your attention, but notice the opposite. Your left big toe. It's now salient to you. Attention can also make things that weren't salient to you. So you can loop these. I can use my attention to make something salient. So now it's more likely to catch my attention, which makes it salient, which is more likely to catch my attention. And then I'm buying the alcohol, right? And so the bullshit is really, really the result of, again, this machinery of relevance realization and making things salient and obvious to us being disconnected from the pursuit of what's true or what's real.
Yeah, absolutely. So
sorry, that was a long speech, but I tried to get an idea through.
That was great, because I think it's really important, because I think it's really at the center of what you're trying to describe, right? What you're trying to describe is, because of the way that we're set up cognitively, we can either essentially engage in ways of bullshitting ourselves, and then there will be costs, or
traumatic costs,
or we can set up and create systems that allow us to systematically learn to overcome our bullshit
and optimize so that we can get more connected to that reality.
Yes. And this is something that's interesting. This word connection has come up a lot. And that's something that I've noticed for myself in my work, right? So I teach this week-long workshop in the summer. And, I basically just wanted to teach people movement in the woods, and we'd enjoy a camping trip together. But people came out of it and they're like, this is life-changing. This is all these things. And so I started trying to articulate what that was getting back from me. And I came up with these 4 basic reconnections that people are making. Through play, they're actually reconnecting through the flow state. They're reconnecting to their own real emotions, their own real sense of themselves, what actually motivates them.
I agree. Keep going, please.
They're reconnecting to nature, which is super relevant to human beings. They're reconnecting to a tribe, to other people,
to each other. Yes.
And they're reconnecting to their sense of play, to fun, right? So there's a reconnection to self, a reconnection to play, a reconnection to movement, let's say movement and play. They're reconnecting to the idea that movement is a positive thing for people, because people are frequently in our culture, through team sports, through the physical education system, they have adopted the lesson that they're not good at movement, and movement isn't for them. That it's a punishing, drudgerous, horrible work thing that you do, and that they want to avoid. And so to get people to have this reconnection, that's like, oh, this can be fun, is really powerful. So it seems to me that one of the central problems that we're facing is that the things that are nourishing to us in general, there are these sort of emergent systematic problems that tend to disconnect us from that. And that what we need is means or technologies, psychotechnologies, of overcoming the things that would tend to distract us or take us away from what's really meaningful, and to move towards the things that are actually meaningful.
Both distraction and distortion. So I think that's really what you said, I think is really important. I mean, when you look, I'm doing work with Talia Bransidis, Jensen Kim, and Philip Ridgewitz on this, what's the literature say about meaning in life? And, and so there's the psychological literature, there's the excellent book by Susan Wolf, Meaning in Life and Why It Matters. And why I bring it up is the 2 themes that are emerging out of what is it when people are talking about when they're talking about meaning, because actually they're using a metaphor, right?
Yes.
They're saying there's something about my life that's like how a sentence, connects to my mind, right? It's a metaphor. So what's the metaphor actually pointing to, right? And it's pointing to these 2 things we've been talking about, and the one you just emphasized. One is the sense of coherence. This is the sense of, right, making sense, zeroing in on what's relevant, being right, so that I get how I fit in, and then that coherence is to the other thing is connectedness. I need to be connected, right? I need to be connected to myself. I need to be connected to what I take to be real, that these are really important. I need to be connected to other people. And they needs to be reciprocal connections. They have to be capable of reciprocal realization, right? So if I'm well connected to you, it's a meaningful connection if as I reveal myself to you, that affords you revealing yourself to me, and we get this reciprocal realization going that makes for a really meaningful conversation, right? So this making sense, and I think these are just two sides of the same thing, by the way. So this is only an analytic distinction. This making sense and this being connected, not in just some static sense, but in this dynamic sense of being coupled to the environment in reciprocal realization, right? And then the point that Wolf brings up, we need to be connected to things so that we feel, that are bigger than us, that we're connected to something that has a value above and beyond our just merely liking it or finding pleasure in it.
Yeah, absolutely. So to go back to the original frame, right?
Yeah.
Club. The narrator and Tyler Durden are sitting there, and what he describes is a sense that the actions that he's taking on a day-to-day level make no sense to him.
Exactly, and they afford no connection.
They afford no connection, and that's the fundamental problem that we're sort of facing. And I wanted to kind of explain one of my central ideas to you, and I think this might be interesting to you, hopefully. But it's something that, I was listening to your podcast with the Soul podcast or something. I really
Yep. That was
super good one. And at the end, you talked about Nietzsche talking about the death of God.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is something that Peterson talks about as well. This idea that as the worldview that was founded on, say, Christ, or say the axial revolution of this dual world was eroded away, took away these tools that we had to make sense of meaning. And so I think that's true. And I am curious whether there's perhaps a broader way that we could frame this. And, as I said, my background's in anthropology. I'm also very interested in evolutionary biology. And
of course,
from an evolutionary biology perspective, there's this basic principle that when things change faster, the adaptation of an organism or a system tends to adopt more broken solutions with kludges, right?
Yeah.
So from a genetic perspective, essentially, if you have a region of the gene that is suddenly, a region of the gene genetic code that's suddenly under positive selection, and that positive selection is very positive, or is very strong, the whole area around it will move. And likewise, if you have an area that's under really powerful negative selection, the whole area around it will move. And I think this is probably what's happening on a mimetic evolutionary perspective too. It's like if you blow out the idea of God because it suddenly doesn't fit with the environment that you have, you don't know how many other things that you disturb.
Yep. And I think that, I think, and Chris and Philip agree with me on this. I think that's the whole, because when you get Nietzsche's story of the madman running into the marketplace and pronouncing that God is dead, that's what he's telling them. He says, you don't understand what you've done, but you've got to read it. And he's talking to the atheists, by the way, right? You don't understand what you've done. We've taken a sponge and we've erased the sky and we're forever falling. That's important. And then he also says, we have to become worthy of this. We have to go through a process of self-transformation and self-transcendence. It's not just a matter of changing our beliefs or adopting a new ideology. We have to go through a fundamental change in who and what we are and how we are in the world in order to be worthy of what's happened. And so there's two aspects to this. It's like you got to open up your understanding and see what's actually going on here. And then you've got to realize that understanding is challenging you indispensably to a process of self-transcendence and self-transformation.
Yeah. So That's really interesting. I just sort of grokked that about you, really, literally today, listening to this. But that's kind of the end point of your argument, is that due to this disruption, there's this necessity for us to take this step of self-transcendence, that we have to do it.
I think so. And then trying to point out in ways that I think that are consonant and convergent with what you're doing, how we have the natural capacities to do this, we also have we have both natural capacities and historical heritage, that if we properly understand the natural capacities and we properly salvage from our historical heritage, we can craft the solution. I don't think Nietzsche came up with a solution to the problem that he posed.
Yeah.
I think the problem with Nietzsche is all he did was invert the grammar of Christianity in important ways. I mean, this is a Heideggerian critique of Nietzsche, and I won't get into it in depth. But I think Nietzsche posed the problem well, and I don't think he solved it. And I think there's a lot of work we have to do, and it's two kinds of work. It's both the theoretical work of getting that understanding, and then it is the existential spiritual work of going through the developmental transformation that we need to go through.
Yeah. So kind of the way that I've thought about this, which I think is slightly different, but I think it's perfectly congruent. Actually, I think they really will lock into each other well. If you think about that model of essentially evolution, let's say, is getting faster. The evolution of human culture is increasing since the 12th century or some period before that, where you have this explosion in the rise of capitalism and the rise of kind of the empirical mind that allowed us to create technologies much faster. But when our economic situation, so you talk about psychotechnologies, I think of culture as a set of, culture is technology. It's technology that allows the organism to effectively orient to its environment. But the thing is that the environment is the ecology, it's the economics, it's the technology, it's the ideological situation, it's all those things.
Yes.
And when the technology changes, it changes our environment, it changes the optimal set of behaviors. Like, this smartphone, I like to point out, has completely changed our world, and we have no psychotechnologies around how to optimally integrate with a tool that's this powerful and this pervasive in its effects. So,
totally. I mean, and we have to pay attention to it.
Yeah. Can I just finish this?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
It's central to my thoughts, and I think it'll make a nice frame. So you end up with this problem that the speed of culture is changing, because you have these two functions: the function that improves propositional knowledge, let's say, which is science, and the function that improves the production of capital.
Yes.
But those two things have, even though they've tremendously improved our lives in many, many ways, they don't improve all the things that matter to human beings, and they can erode things that matter to us. And so we have this problem that we have to figure out how to write good code faster than we've ever wrote it before.
I think so. I'm sorry I interrupted, because you were actually, that's a really good point you made. And I mean, you can point your viewers to clear examples of this. Like, it's becoming increasingly clear that Instagram is just really bad for your mental health. Like, it's just really bad for your mental health. I'm aware. It really is a powerful inducer of a depressive mindset, and it also traps you in the having mode and cuts off your access to the being mode and all that. So it's and there's just increasing evidence. So you can point to many examples of exactly what you're talking about. Right? We have all these emerging technologies, and they have all their manifest goals, but they have all of these latent side effects that are tremendously eroding our capacities for meaning making. Now, what gives me hope is that the science can also be turned onto the meaning-making machinery, cognitive science, and we can also think about how we can relate to these technologies better, because that's what we are. We're not, to use Andy Clark's term, we're natural-born cyborgs. We've been meshing with technology since Australopithecines, right? And so we can get a better understanding of all of that, and there's a chance So I'm not speaking teleologically here, but there's a chance that we can coordinate psychotechnologies and new emerging cyber technologies so that we can actually cultivate the wisdom of how to use and develop these, emerging psychotechnologies and cyber technologies.
Yes.
That's a real chance for us.
Yeah. So then kind of my solution that I've been working on towards this problem is like, science and technology and capitalism have rapidly increased certain goods, right?
Yeah.
They've eroded things like connection to family, connection to community, connection to land, like knowledge of the environment, all these other things are getting eroded. So so what I've sort of looked at is we have to sort of look back and this is where this ancestral paradigm becomes important and start saying, how do we recapture the pieces that are that were valuable in the environment? Mm-hmm. I like Peterson's analogy of bringing back the bones of your father from the underworld, right?
Right. Go ahead.
Recover that, and it seems to me that what your project is essentially articulating how these wisdom traditions within like Buddhism and Taoism and similar traditions give us paths to wisdom, and in ways that we can now make congruent with cognitive science without accepting some of the bullshit that was layered into that, or some that was not consistent.
Now, I agree with that. There's one caveat I would make. I mean, I don't want your viewers to think that means that the Buddhism and Taoism get a free pass.
Yeah.
They should also be subject to lots of criticism and reflection as well. But yeah, I take your point. I mean, I want to look at all of these revolutions where we went through these sort of massive leaps, the upper Paleolithic transition, and I mean this respectfully. I think you're plugging into a lot of that in a very powerful way. But I also want to plug into what came out of the Axial Revolution, right? I want to plug into that one too, and I want to try and coordinate those together in powerful ways and try to understand how can we bring all of these together. And I want to also plug into what's happening with the cyber revolution, with the computational, like what's happening there again, and try and salvage from that. So I want to try and grab from wherever I can to try and create ecologies of psychotechnologies that will be really capable of self-organizing and being able to grow and develop and keep pace with this accelerating world.
Yeah, absolutely. So, essentially, I was trying to not get too much into all the other things because I'm still interested in having this conversation with you, because I want to talk about the role of movement practices within this.
Totally, me too. Yeah,
that I think is really cool and unique about you is that you're talking about these wisdom traditions, and you're talking about the science and how you put them together, say spirituality and science, but also your Tai Chi Chuan practice.
Yeah.
And you
for 28 years now.
28 years, and you understand that there are things that you have to learn by embodying them.
Yes, very much. I mean, again, the access to the procedural knowing, the perspectival knowing, the participatory knowing is right via embodiment, both embodiment and embeddedness, right? The way I'm, deeply embodied and the way I'm deeply embedded and connected to my environment.
Yeah. So let's get into how movement culture plays into it. So if we have this model that essentially our culture has been throwing away really valuable pieces because they weren't up to date. One of the pieces that I think that we've really thrown away is, connection to our bodies through movement, play, and connection to nature.
Yes, very much. All of those. Yes, I agree.
But then there's this, I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing. It's like the broader culture is like a river, and then it creates these like backwaters that are almost more intense versions of what's come before, because at the same time that we have the least active population in history, we have the most extreme athletes that have ever existed. Like the top of parkour and other flow sports are doing things that humans have never imagined. And they're stretching what's possible in this really interesting way. So so I wanted to note that, but you talked about embodied cognition, right?
Yes.
There's this tendency, it seems like, to think that we can derive wisdom or we can have wisdom purely through articulation, right? Purely through knowledge.
Yeah.
The Descartesian idea that we are a body or we are a mind, and the body is sort of
a Cartesian idea of that. Yeah, for sure.
So I wanted to just let's get into that. But I wanted to, I guess, start with the idea of like, I started with parkour, right? And started with all these other things, but parkour was the first thing that really felt deeply meaningful to me in a way that nothing else had felt.
Sure.
I dug deep into this process, and I found that I needed something to be aimed at. And initially I started aiming at like benchmarks, a competition, lifting a specific amount of weight, doing a specific jump. And eventually I had this realization that those weren't deeply motivating to me.
Right. They're extrinsic. Yeah.
So trying to find the intrinsic motivation.
Right.
And then it was like, well, just following the whim of the moment wasn't enough. I had to have something that structured it.
Yeah.
And so then I encountered Peterson's work, and it was like this idea of, okay, the archetype you're aimed at, that's big enough to be aimed at something. And then it occurred to me that essentially what someone who's doing parkour is acting out is this basic idea that I think of it now as like motor behavioral therapy.
Right. So there's a lot of work around what's called motor intentionality, but go ahead.
Yeah. You are acting out the idea that if you walk out into the world and intentionally approach things that scare you, you get a chance to grow. Through intentionally putting yourself on the edge of chaos and cultivating those flow states, there's something about you that grows stronger. And so I think that's the core of this idea of like a parkour philosophy, which is something that's been talked about a lot, but has never been really articulated. And so what I see then is, if you say that, why do you do that? You do that because it is meaningful to you. And you do that because the person you become is something that you admire more.
Right.
And then the question is, well, can you articulate what that is? And then can you actually generalize those insights as effectively as possible? And so this is where I think the conversation with you and what you're doing is really particularly interesting and powerful for me and for the movement community, is how do we wrap how do we articulate the benefits of these practices and then create the psychotechnologies that allow us to cultivate wisdom, cultivate virtue in this broader way. Does anything come up for you when I kind of lay that out?
Too much. For someone who just claimed that nobody's articulating the philosophy of parkour, I think you were doing a very, very good job at it. So, I mean, there's lots of things. I mean, you invoked it. I mean, so part of, you invoked the idea of flow, right? And we should talk about that what that means. And I just published something in the Oxford Handbook of Spontaneous Thought about flow and what's the machinery of flow and trying to understand it. And why does flow, try make people, one of the things that will make you rate your life as better is if you have more flow experiences in it. Why is that the case? How does the flow? I'm arguing in a new book that I mentioned. I'm working on with Daniel Craig and Madeline Abramian and Hannah Chow. It's called The Cognitive Continuum from Insight to Enlightenment, about how the machinery of insight is actually being exapted, right, into flow, and then how that machinery is getting exapted into certain kinds of mystical experiences, and then how that gets exapted into these transformative experiences that lead people to fundamentally transform themselves. And what I'm trying to argue is it's basically the same machinery. It's just getting sort of ratcheted up in powerful ways. And so, again, I think just to get the intuitive connections for your viewers, when you have a moment of insight, right? Think about that. It's like there's clarity, there's coherence, and it's literally like a flash. And then there's a deep sense of connectedness to it. Like I notice the language. I really get it, right? Like I really grab. Yeah, right, exactly, right. And so there, like, if you get that, what that machinery is doing is insight is like this powerful ratcheting up of the processes that we then experience as meaningful. And then I think what the flow state is, and you've seen this in the video series, I think the flow state is a chaining of a bunch of insights together. It's an insight cascade, right? And I think it's also powerfully improving our capacity for implicit learning, but that's another argument I'll put aside for now, right? And then I think what's happening when we're getting into certain mystical experiences, and we just ran an experiment in my lab that, the more mystical experiences you have, the more likely you are to rate your life as meaningful.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so what's happening in at least some mystical experiences is you're getting a flow state, but it's not a flow state for, this particular problem or this particular thing. It's a flow state at the level of what we've been talking about throughout our discussion. It's like your flow state for like how you're getting an optimal cognitive grip on yourself and the world and how they fit together. That's why when people are in these, they have no propositions for it. Mm-hmm. It's ineffable. But, and they use this language of oneness and clarity and connectedness and realness, because that's, I think, what's fundamentally going on there. And so I think that there's deep connections, if you'll allow me a metaphor, there's deep connections between, movement in the physical sense, right? And then these movements of mind that are responsible for transformation and meaning making. Yeah. And that's look, it's like you do biological evolution. And so I point you to the work of like Michael Anderson and others, and they talk about how much, and Andreas Wagner and others, and how much of our biological evolution has been driven by exaptation, right? Right. So my tongues did not evolve for speech. They evolved for poison detection and for moving food around. But because they have lots of nerves and because they're so flexible, I can make a speech-making machine out of them. I don't have to create a speech machine out of from scratch, right? And Michael Anderson's idea is our brains are also doing that. Like we're constantly exapting. We're constantly taking things that we sort of developed for one set of purposes or functions, either biologically or through learning, and then we exact them. Now, I am making a point that is going to, I think, be really relevant to the people in your community. Look, we talk about, this area greatly expands, during evolution, the frontal cortex. But you know what other area of the brain is expanding even faster? Mm-hmm. The cerebellum. Yeah. And the cerebellum is expanding, and it doesn't, and part of it might be that we're bipedal, but that doesn't strike me as any more challenging than brachiation through trees, right? Right. So why is the cerebellum expanding so much? And here's a view that was originally sort of radical in around 2007, but by 2014, there's a consensus paper on it that the cerebellum, which originally evolved for coordination and physical balance, mm-hmm. has been exapted to fine-tune the frontal cortex for conceptual, right, balance and integration and coordination. And you're often using the same machinery that you use to navigate through physical space to navigate through conceptual and theoretical space, right? That's what I'm trying to make a deep argument about the deep connections between physical movement and cognitive movement.
Yeah, this is something I've talked about quite a bit, is the idea that essentially what your cognition or your narrative self is doing in some sense is modeling motor actions, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Modeling, I will do this, I would act this out, and it's firing motor neurons, and then it's saying something good will happen or something good won't happen. And because we can model it, we don't have to act out all those solutions.
That's right.
We get to select among them.
I agree. And what I'm suggesting to you, it also goes the other way. It's precisely because you built up all this sensory motor competence that you can then reuse that tool to, right, think about the relationship between Descartes' philosophy and the meaning crisis, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think these two things are deeply connected. Like, I heard you say this in another one, that you basically don't think that the cerebellum continue to expand because of movement demands. And I think that I would challenge you a little bit on that. I think it did, because I think that one of the things that makes human beings really unique is actually our plasticity of movement capacity.
Yeah.
There's an idea that Bernstein talks about. I'd recommend checking out Bernstein here. But the idea is, like, if you look at any one capacity, except something like throwing, human beings are not very exceptional compared to most animals.
Right.
But if you look at the diversity of things that you see at the Olympics, there's no other animal that could accomplish all the things that we could do, right?
Yeah, we're multi-act. Yeah.
We are, but they can't swim, right?
Right.
They can't throw, and they can't lift heavy things. You know, a rhinoceros is much stronger, but, you know, they don't have anywhere near our dexterity. So we expanded the brain in part to control the most complex movement capacity that anything has. And at the same time, that's getting exacted into cognition, and are basically self-reinforcing. They're looping on each other.
Right. So yes, you're right, and your correction is well taken. And no, I think you're right. I want to admit when I should change what I'm saying, and I think it's what I mean. You understand who I was addressing? I was addressing people who were trying to give a purely sort of bottom-up account of why the cerebellum changed. And I think this way you've talked about it, about the enhancement of the multi-aptness of our physical movement and our cognitive evolution are actually co-evolving together. I think that is a better way of putting it.
So, which is actually, it's really cool because it ties into what we're saying right here. Kind of the themes of this conversation that I've been trying to bring out is that to enhance the multi-aptness of a human being and to take them towards that state of self-transcendence, something that combines these practices of mindfulness and contemplative practice and consciousness practice with something that allows the body to be involved and make that wisdom deeply embodied, seems to me like the best solution that we can use going forward.
And and I totally agree with it. And one of my criticisms, again, of how mindfulness has been imported, I mean, I think the mindfulness revolution is a symptom of the meaning crisis. The reason why, that this is, what's happening. But one of my criticisms of it is we have imported mindfulness. We've taken it out of an ecology of practice, like the Eightfold Path, for example. That's an ecology of practices. It's represented by a wheel, right? It's an ecology of practices. And we've taken out one thing. And then what we have is this seated still practice of mindfulness. Mm-hmm. And yes, does that improve your ability? Sure it does, but that's not, you can often make the mistake of, pursuing a lesser good in favor of a greater good. Oh, well, this has improved me. Now I stop. This is a version of the Einstellung effect, right? And so, yes, the seated practice will make your life better, but that doesn't mean that it's the best, right? Mm-hmm. That's a mistake. Like having an ecology of practices, and definitely, like I constantly argue that you need a movement mindfulness practice with the seated practices, and also the seated practices have to involve the body much more than is traditionally being taught. Yes,
beautiful.
Totally
beautiful. You said something in that interview I was listening to that really rang true for me. I posted this today. Don't tell me what you believe. Tell me what you practice.
Yes, very much.
How those practices are making you more wise, more compassionate, more capable of self-transcendent, and more capable of changing the world.
Yes, that's right. Because another symptom, I would argue, it's not only a symptom, it's exacerbating feedback of the meaning crisis, is that we represent the meaning crisis as ideological opposition that is going to be resolved by adversarial combat with winner take all. And so we are stuck at this level where meaning is not actually ultimately being made, the propositional level. And then we've given up the idea of a opponent processing within like a self-organizing process. And this is what point my friend Leo Ferraro often makes. And we replace this with this adversarial, bottom line, winner take all. And that whole move misrepresents, misleads, and exacerbates the meaning crisis. So I don't want to, ultimately I care about what you believe or we couldn't have this conversation, but what matters to me is what do you practice and how is that working to transform you in the ways that we've been talking about? Yes.
Yeah.
Because that's where we have to look.
So this is really interesting to me because I've been hammering at the idea of like taking Peterson's thesis that basically there's the realm of action, which is religion, the realm of knowledge or information, let's say science. Basically, what we're doing in movement practices, that self-cultivation thing would fit into this religious bracket, right? And if you start expanding these ideas to say, well, I'm not just going to teach you how to jump farther. I'm going to teach you how jumping and overcoming something allows you to overcome fear and become more courageous, and how that can be applied to the rest of your life.
Yes.
How you're doing something that's bigger. And then if you take on the idea of the heroic archetype is the thing you're aimed at, is that Christ? And then are you a Christian pastor teaching, right?
Yeah.
But
so this is, go ahead.
When I ran into your work, and then also listening to a couple of my friends, it crystallized for me that if you look at the Eastern traditions, it's a nice way to kind of a different lens, because you have more syncretism there, right? You can be a Buddhist and a Taoist. You can practice these things together, and you can practice. And there's a difference between orthodoxy, belief, and orthopraxy. Right?
Yes.
The Protestant tradition in the United States is very much about the belief, the idea that
it's creedal. It's creedal.
Yeah. Is fully believing is the only thing. If you can absolutely accept Jesus as your savior, and it's in you, and you completely accept that, then you're saved. But in a lot of other religious traditions, it's not so much what you believe, it's whether you're practicing the thing. And this is sorry, I'm kind of ranting here, but this is all very important to me. So I grew up in the hippie community, right?
Sure.
And so I grew up in this community of people who are talking about spirituality. They're talking about love, and so people would say, "Oh, I love you. We're in the spirit, bringing the light into the world." And then I looked at how people behaved.
Right.
Behaving like
a lot of bullshit. Yeah.
Right? And so I was like, I don't care what you believe.
Yeah.
So what I'm interested in is, how do we go about building these practices? And then when you look at it like that, it's essentially like, well, the Taoism or Buddhism or Vipassana, whatever. What it seems like you're doing is you're extracting them from the necessity of a supernatural claim to recognize that they're useful technologies that we can apply to life.
Right. I think that's the case. I would also like to emphasize, and I think the series makes this clear, we have our own wisdom traditions that we also need to go back and pay more attention to. The Neoplatonic tradition and Arthur Verse Lewis's work on this, I think, is really, really essential. We got to reconnect to that. And I think that we don't have to stick with the two worlds mythology, because the idea of the supernatural is a particularly creedal, metaphysically ossified way of doing, right, the two worlds. And we don't have to commit to the two worlds mythology, right, in order to recover even our own wisdom traditions, the Neoplatonic, even the Neoplatonic Christian tradition. We don't have to do that. And so I'm pausing because I'm trying to, I'll introduce it, but I think there is a way in which we can reintroduce the notion of sacredness as something different from, right, sort of supernatural power, that we can understand sacredness instead as, Plato is sacred to me because I can constantly return to Plato, and Plato's a font of new intelligibility, new ways of making sense, right? And new ways of having insight through illusion, into new ways of understanding and embodying love and so it's not that I think Plato is, perfect or error-free, but as I grow, Plato seems to grow with me. And there's a constant resonance that is constantly helping to articulate me, the world, open it up, help me connect, help me reflect, help me to communicate. And so what I'm proposing to you is, not only can we sort of get free of the two worlds mythology, right? If we can let go of the commitment to the supernatural, there's the opportunity, and other people are working on this. This is not my idea alone by any means, that we can come up with a new way of understanding sacredness. And I think that sacredness is ultimately about, right, this process of connectedness and meaning making, and that we find sets of psychotechnologies that can constantly evolve our capacity to reconnect deeply to ourselves, to each other in the world. And that's what sacredness is. It's this capacity for an evolutionary process of connection, I mean cognitive evolution, rather than the possession of a supernatural property in an object or thing or person.
Yeah, that resonates tremendously with me. You know, I'm a agnostic atheist, let's say. I don't think that we can know. I think that I've seen no evidence that would make it seem like it's logical to presume that God exists.
Right.
And so there is this potential for sort of disenchantment of the world.
Yes.
But through the physical practices, I have moments of awe, right?
Yes.
I have moments of ecstasy, right? Like being in these incredible places and seeing the beauty of nature. And I think that the idea that nature is sacred, that movement is sacred, that's
viable to you now, right? It's viable to you, right?
Yeah.
That's the point. Sacredness is about that viability.
Yeah.
It's not about the truth, the assertability of propositions. Yes, very much.
And so I think that, you know, again, it goes back to the practice, right?
Mm-hmm. Always.
And when I connect, you know, one of the things I feel, there's a metaphor that a friend of mine, Daniel Eisenman, uses. He talks about the menu versus the meal, right? It's like all this propositional knowledge. Like I can sit here on a computer and I can read all day and acquire propositional knowledge, but it's not necessarily very meaningful. Or I can go out and have experiences that are really meaningful. So if we think about, this is one of the things that's important to me about the practice of movement in nature is we're creating a relational connection with nature.
Yes.
Right? If I look at a picture of a beautiful tree on my computer, it has some impact on me. Right? If I read about the tree on Wikipedia, it has some impact on me. If I go to the tree and I look at it, it has an impact on me. But if I move in the tree, it has an entirely different impact on me. If I learn the ways that it can be used, if I learn what animals might be taken from that tree, like all those things layer meaning in a deeper way for me. I think of like nature as you talk about in your talks about literacy and what would be taken from people if we stripped literacy of their mind.
Sure.
I think that what we've actually done is stripped physical and nature literacy out of people. Like if we look at hunter-foragers, they walk through the woods and they read the environment the way that we read a book. And to us, wall of green.
Yes, no, I agree with that. And I mean, I think you were doing it, and I mean this in a complimentary fashion. I think you're doing with the tree what I was talking about with Plato, right? You're getting to a situation where there's ongoing reciprocal realization. You're being opened up as the tree is being opened up. And, you know, and Plato is clear about this, right? That this is a kind of love, because I mean, love between people is reciprocal realization, right? Whether it's friendship love or romantic love. And you can get that reality is disclosing itself more to you in a fashion that's coupled to how you are opening yourself up and getting insight. Listen to the word insight more and more into it, right? And so I think, that is the way. Now, are you making the tree sacred? No, that's romanticism. That's the idea that it's a subjective projection. Is sacredness in the tree sort of like as a metaphysical property? No, that's, but as you said, it's relational, it's transjective. The sacredness is something that the tree and I are co-creating together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that idea of the co-creation, I think where ecological dynamics theory gets so interesting is this idea that everything is this relationship between the agent and the arena.
Yeah, for sure.
Meaningness is in that anyways.
Yes, at least that. Yes, for sure.
So there's this layer of the movement that I wanted to get into. And one thing I wanted to bring up and talk to you about to kind of bring us back to is flow. And also this idea of means of getting rid of bullshit.
Yes.
Right? So in the flow state, you have this necessity for a tight coupling of feedback with action, right?
Clear information, tight feedback. You need a really tight relationship between demand and your skills. Yes, all the stuff that Csikszentmihalyi talks about.
Yeah, which is also, have you read Super Forecasting by Philip Tetlock?
No, I've heard of it though.
But also a really good book. But he also talks about essentially insight into how things actually work is also dependent on the same process. You have to make create a clear decision or clear action around what's going to happen. It's like, I predict exactly this. And then you have to feed yourself information that will either confirm or disconfirm as fast as possible.
Yeah, tightly coupled. Yep.
So this tight coupling is really important. And this is where I think that parkour is this really cool psychotechnology, let's say.
Well, of course. Yeah, it's got all the features, right? You've got to have, it can't be ambiguous, right? You have tight feedback. Error matters. Error is clearly diagnostic. Yeah. Right. And then, of course, you're constantly having to innovate. You're constantly having to stretch your skills to match the dynamic ratcheting up, or at least, shifting of the demands that are placed upon you. I mean, yeah, parkour is kind of like jazz movement, right? It has all of the features in it, for sure.
Yeah. And so what's interesting to me about it is like, so I'm also a martial artist, and you've had this interesting revolution in martial arts with MMA, right? Where traditionally martial artists could get away with making a lot of claims.
Right? Yes. Yeah.
It's like you do something beautiful, it's great. People don't fight very often, so they don't have a way to test those claims. They don't have that tight feedback.
That's right.
And then all of a sudden with MMA, it's like the feedback that comes into martial arts, it's like, well, these techniques are either working or they're not. Really amazing about the process in parkour to me is you can't lie to yourself at all.
No.
You have to be real.
You have to be careful. I mean, I agree with that.
You can't bullshit yourself.
Well, sorry, but that wasn't what I was saying. What I wanted to make it clear is that the flow state has that capacity, but the flow state itself can be hijacked. Right. Yes. And so you can, and the WHO is considering making this a bona fide thing. You can become a video game addict. I mean, video games are flow induction machines, but they're a kind of bullshit, because although they're activating this machinery that's designed to get us to cut through to reality, what they do is give us a virtual reality that we're connecting to rather than reality. And so you know what I'm trying to suggest, although you're doing flow within the game setting itself can create an addictive kind of situation for you, and you can fall into. There's nothing, even flow, that we can't turn into a mechanism for self-deception. I mean, this is my interpretation of the Buddha's, all life is suffering, I think, which is a very bad translation. Yeah. I think it's basically, there's nothing about you and there's no thing you do that can't be beset or twisted into self-deception, right?
Yeah. What I always say is, well, actually, I made this video a few years ago called Stimulation versus Nourishment. And the basic idea there is that it was based on something a friend of mine, Stephan Guyenet, said. He said that what the food industry has done is they divorced flavor from nutrition.
Yeah, that's bullshit. The salience has been removed, right, from the truth or the reality of the food. Exactly. It's causal efficacy for us.
And that's the cause of the obesity epidemic. When he said, I had this insight cascade, as you would say, that this is essentially, you could look at any number of like very popular products as doing this. That what a video game does is it divorces thrill or the flow state from physicality.
Yes.
And therefore the benefit to the individual is rapidly diminished, right? And it's hyper stimulating. So it's more, you can get more of it. Right?
Yes.
Without effort, right? It's like when I do parkour, I can't tap into my flow state, but it's like I can only train for a few hours because my body will break down. But I can play video games for
it has built-in constraints.
Exactly. Sexuality, right? Pornography is sexuality divorced from relationships. Relationships have all of this challenge and friction that forces you to grow.
Exactly.
Avoid all that. Social media. Social media is this way of getting approval, right? Of getting dopamine hits from people liking your posts without actually engaging in real dialogue or real face-to-face, and all those things that you get that nourish you from a standpoint. So I have this heuristic, which is basically like, if it was fun before, like, the 1800s or something, it's really good for you. It's invented after that, and it's really fun. It's probably bad for you.
Yeah, that's a good rule of thumb to at least start sorting things. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's right. I think the idea about, paying attention to, I like that way of putting it, paying attention to stimulation versus nourishment, or, that maps very well on paying attention to, are you finding it very salient, or are you finding it very transformative, right? Those are the key things. Now, you should find the transformative salient.
Yes.
Right. But you should also make sure that what you're finding salient is also transformative. Yes, for sure.
Absolutely. So this brings us back actually to this idea I introduced earlier, that essentially the capitalism, it's a function that optimizes for production of capital, right?
Right.
There's this emergent problem that if you can create something that's hyper stimulating, that is cheap to produce, relatively cheap to produce, or has high margins, that's the best way to win at the capitalist game. It just so happens that erodes a lot of the things that human beings actually deeply nourish human beings.
Yeah, it's a short-term gain for long-term peril, right? So this is where I evoke the Frommian distinction that you mentioned at the very beginning, between the having mode and the being mode. Fromm's point is that both of these modes are legitimate, right? The having mode is we have to have things. We have to have water. We have to have food. We literally have to consume and import these things into our bodies, right? And then there's a form of cognition and a form of consciousness that's appropriate. Like, so I need to understand things categorically. I need to categorize things, and so all glasses are basically the same for me. And I categorize so I can effectively manipulate and control things so that I can consume. And, and I have an I-it relationship with things, all of that. And again, nothing wrong with that, right? You shouldn't have a deeply spiritual relationship, right, to everything in your environment, because you're not going to leave your room in the morning, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, right, we have being needs. That's Fromm's word for it. I like to think of them better as developmental needs, as becoming needs. We need to become mature, right? We need to become virtuous. We need to be in love. We need to become capable of giving and receiving love. Now, the problem we have is that the framework around that is a very different framework, right? I don't want to relate to things categorically, right? I want to relate to them, right, expressively. I want to be able to couple them. I want to be able to participate in reciprocal realization with them. And I'm not trying to just, like, when I'm in the having mode, I'm solving problems. When I'm in the developing mode, I'm confronting transformational challenge, which is a very, very different thing from, look, grief isn't a problem to be solved. It's like, oh, you're in grief. Like, the answer is 17, or the answer is do this. Right? Grief is a developmental challenge you have to go through. There's no alternative to that, right? You have to go through grief. Now, why am I saying this? Because both of these are important sets of needs for us, and they have different cognitive frames, different ways in which our consciousness and our identities are taking shape. Both are appropriate. And so Fromm's point is modal confusion. Modal confusion is when you use the wrong mode for the needs that you're trying to get. Mm-hmm. Coming back to your point about capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So if I can get you to think that, right, the way you become mature is by having a car, or the way you become spiritual is by having, right, a drink or some experience, right, a rave,
an ayahuasca ceremony,
right, or that you can be in love by having lots of sex, right? Then I can sell you stuff.
Yes.
Right. Then I can sell you stuff. But the thing is, right, as long as I'm modally confused, those being needs aren't actually being met. So what do? As long as I'm trapped in modal confusion, I intensify my effort. Well, it must mean I need a better car. I must have more sex. Maybe I need to collect more of these spiritual experiences in order to show how unique and wonderful and special I am. Right? I need to have more of them. Right? And so what happens is, right, you get caught up in, right, consuming and consuming and consuming and consuming in an ever increasing rate, but ultimately more and more it's not satisfying to you. And then what Fromm predicted, and I think in a very prescient manner, is at some point people say, well, screw it. And they start getting violent and destructive, because at least in the violence and the destruction, they have returned to trying to be embodied and engaged with some kind of developmental change.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's beautiful. That was perfect, because it actually goes right back to the thing that I started with, right? The story,
right?
Of Fight Club, right? In the story of Fight Club, you have the narrator who's
right.
having mode. He meets
yes.
who's essentially in the being mode. He's rejecting all of that. He's all about what is he experiencing in the moment, right?
Right.
He doesn't
right.
want to deal with all this. And then, so I was listening to you talk about the having versus the being mode, and it seemed to me that you need to talk about, or it seems to me that there's a triumph. There's three there. There's having, being, and becoming. Those are three separate modes, right? Because it seems to me a practice like mindfulness is about your subjective moment-to-moment experience.
Okay.
A practice like parkour is more about becoming something more powerful.
Sure.
Right? There's the subjective moment-to-moment experience of it, but that's so driven by the idea that you're going to jump farther, you're going to do bigger things, you're going to do this.
Sure.
And so I've so then what's interesting, you brought up the idea that when we're stuck in that, we get into violence, because that's what happens in the story, right?
Yeah, that's right.
These alienated young men, they find that there's a process that they can engage in that starts them into this becoming mode, but it's not culturally mature. It doesn't have a good direction, and so it ends up going down the path to something dark. And I think that this is one of the central problems that we face. Like, I think this is behind the rise of like the alt-right and like crazy SJW is this need to identify and be engaged in a process that's meaningful.
Yes, I think that's right.
And we need mature cultural traditions that allow us to cultivate that in a sophisticated way.
Yes, and I mean, and Fight Club even. I think it's been around long enough that I'm not going to be guilty of a spoiler, right? I mean, and Fight Club even has the idea that I forget the name, the Brad Pitt character's name.
Tyler Durden.
Yeah, is ultimately a projection, right? And that what is needed is an integration and an actual, remembering and reintegration of these two things together.
Reconnection.
Yeah, very much. And so I think that's fundamentally right. I don't know. I don't know. I want to change what I'm going to say. I used to be a lot more pessimistic about all of this, but one of the gifts of the video series is that I have become more and more connected to people like yourself in many different ways, like what you're doing. And I'm talking to a guy who's got a dojo, and he's trying to figure out how can I bring in the wisdom practices to do character cultivation, right? Wisdom cultivation with the martial arts. I'm talking to people who are, how can we set up secular monasteries, and how can we create networks, right? So what has just made an impression on me, right? It's really making me more optimistic, which is not sort of my natural orientation, right? Is that there is more and more of this bottom-up grassroots attempts to create real practices, real cultures of awakening, real communities for responding to and addressing the meaning crisis. That has just been deeply, deeply encouraging to me. And I just wanted, I want to share that with your viewers, because I don't want them feeling that they're isolated either. That no, this is, it's not just, the thrashing, the violence in response to the meaning crisis. There is also this other thing that is, organically growing in response that I think holds real hope, real rationally acceptable hope for giving us a response to the meaning crisis.
That's perfect. I think that these type of conversations like we're having here, where we're bringing people who have deep scientific knowledge, people who've got deep movement practice knowledge, people who have spiritual tradition knowledge together, and networking these ideas through larger sets of people, is where those practices can spread and can become something more sophisticated.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think that's a good place for us to actually close this particular interview.
Okay.
Because it's a wonderful end note, a grace note at the end of this. I really hope that you'll have another conversation with me on this, because I feel like we touched about a million things and would have loved to go much deeper on them.
You invite me, I'll come back, because this was excellent. You were fantastic as an interlocutor. This was I really enjoyed. I felt this was. I mean, I understand. When I'm doing an interview, very often people want me to articulate, and you were affording that. Yeah. But what I'm trying to also compliment is there was a lots of genuine dialogue in what was happening between us, and I found that really enriching.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I will definitely have you on again soon. It was an immense pleasure, and yeah, John Vervaeke, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we're back with John Vervaeke real quick, because I got a couple questions that I think are really valuable. I wanted you to just tell us where people can find your work and how they can kind of continue digging into all these concepts that we've gone into.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. So definitely, I have a YouTube channel, and on the YouTube channel, they can find the video series that we've mentioned a couple times, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. They can also find several playlists about other topics, altered states of consciousness, relationship between AI and our need to cultivate wisdom. There's all kinds of things there that they can make use of. They can go to open book publishers and can read the zombie book that I mentioned, that Chris and Philip and I wrote. They can read that for free online. So just go to open book publishers, put in John Vervaeke, and that book will come up. Or you can order it for Amazon if you need a physical copy, but you can read it for free on open book publishers. And if people really want to dig deep, there's a lot of my academic publications and things like that they can look to. But I would imagine that for most people, what's going to be most useful to them it's the video series and the book.
Cool. And is your website just johnvervaeke.com?
Yeah, the website is that, and like I say, if you go on YouTube and just put in John Vervaeke, you'll get my YouTube channel.
And then last question, for someone who's interested in these topics that we've talked about, if there are 5 books that kind of anybody could go into and get something really valuable out of, what would you recommend?
5 books, the Desert Island books. So I would recommend, first of all, really seriously reconnecting to our own wisdom traditions. And 2 people that I would recommend looking at are the work of Pierre Hadot, What is Ancient Philosophy? And then I would also recommend looking at the work of Arthur Verslewis, his book on the Platonic mysticism or perennial philosophy. Good introduction to those. I would recommend, for those people who really want to wrestle with sort of East-West connections and how that connection can be applied to the meaning crisis, I would recommend getting connected to work on the Kyoto School. Robert Carter's book, The Introduction to the Kyoto School, is really important. And once you do that, right, you might want to tackle a difficult, but one of the 5 best books I've read in my entire life, which is Nishitani's book, Religion and Nothingness, which is all about all of this and the connections to the connections between, I should say, spirituality and addressing meaningless and meaning crisis. It's a seminal work, and it's deeply influential on me. I would also recommend that people read Csikszentmihalyi's Flow book, to get in good touch with that. All of that ideas, and perhaps how many is that? That's 4. I just got to come up with a 5th one. I think you might want to take a look at the Slingerland's book, Trying Not to Try, because he also is bridging between sort of cognitive science and sort of Eastern traditions of flow and development that I think would also be really relevant to your viewers.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Once again, it was wonderful having you on the podcast.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Really enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you for listening to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave a review on iTunes if you can. Finally, as we mentioned before the show, this is a listener-supported podcast, and if you want to have the most regular content, have the best guests on, and give you guys the best quality of audio and video, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Thank you very much, and I look forward to sharing more with you guys soon.